Anniewiborg.
When it comes to the Garden of Eden story, I think people have questions. For example, Adam, had he been a better conversationalist, would Eve have been hanging out with a talking snake? And Eve, she had to wonder what was so bad about eating from the tree of knowledge. So she took a bite of that apple and thereafter was blamed for everything bad that ever happened in the world. They even named a douche product after her. And eons later, and under somewhat different circumstances, I too took a bite of a forbidden fruit. I was 19 years old. I had been dating my first and only boyfriend since we were 16. And we were happy together, and we were hardly ever apart for more than a day or two. But that was about to change because I had enrolled in a 12-month training program in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a 3-hour drive from my hometown in Minnesota. And that first night away, trying to fall asleep in a strange apartment with roommates I had just met, I missed my boyfriend so much, I felt like I had cut off one of my limbs. And I would drive home to see him every weekend, even in a snowstorm once. But eventually, I couldn't afford to go home that often. And on one of the weekends that I stayed back, a roommate invited me to stay with her at her family's farm, telling me that on Saturday we'd go into a dance at the Legion Hall in her small hometown. And I had low expectations, but that dance turned out to be 3 hours of sweaty fun. And I was immediately welcomed into a group of friends who had grown up in the area and, while scattered during the week, would gather on weekends whenever they could. And suddenly it didn't seem like such a deprivation to have to stay in South Dakota for a weekend. I still would go home, drive home to see my boyfriend, but now on those long drives to and from, I found myself having a question, a curiosity, a desire to know what it would be like to be with someone else. And I had a specific someone else in mind, one of that group of friends. He was fun and smart, and he reminded me a little bit of my favorite Beatle, George. And he was interested in me as well, and things progressed quickly. And one day I had to admit to myself that I now had a boyfriend in Minnesota and a boyfriend in South Dakota. But I didn't tell my longtime boyfriend about this, rationalizing that since the new guy and I hadn't slept together, I wasn't really being unfaithful. But that not sleeping together part was getting harder and harder, and no pun intended, honestly. No. And one Saturday, my roommates and I hosted the weekend gathering. And I was standing in our crowded kitchen and I was watching the front door. And when my new guy arrived, he came over to me immediately. He opened his winter coat and he enveloped me in it. And from that moment forward, we were on some sort of steep mountain sliding down. And when that party was finally over, it was just him and I in that living room with the carpet that smelled like spilled beer and the roommates sleeping down the hall. And temptation took us by the hand and led us to that point of no return. And that night, we crossed over it. Now, the next morning, I woke up, and for days after, weeks after, both ecstatic and heartsick at the same time. But though the Rubicon had now been crossed, and we were crossing it regularly, by the way, I still did not tell my boyfriend in Minnesota. I wanted them both. I didn't want to have to choose. But the center could not hold, and when my two worlds collided, I went from 2 boyfriends to 0 boyfriends. But even in the worst of my loss and grief, I clung to this notion that that question that I'd had, that curiosity, that desire to know, had not been wrong, and that it was better to take a bite of the apple at 19 than to push those feelings down the line. Now, I don't know about you, but I try to avoid having fake conversations with biblical characters, imaginary conversations. But as time passed, I found myself thinking about Eve more and more, maybe because I had been kicked out of paradise too. And I could almost hear a voice in her head, and she said that question, that curiosity, that desire to know, those were legit. But she said the road that temptation took you down was not the way to get the answers. And by then, I was already feeling it, shame and regret for what I had done to my sweet boyfriend of 3 years who had only ever loved me and trusted me. And there's just no way around it. That voice, Eve in my head, she was right. Thank you.
I will save this until we get back from our thing. Keep it going for Annie, everybody. I always love hearing Annie's story. She's one of our repeat storytellers. And Annie, I am always amazed with how spicy your life is.